The weapon had not moved in 41 years. This was documented, not as a complaint or an anomaly, but as a simple operational fact recorded in the sanctum's maintenance logs with the same neutral language used to note humidity levels and structural integrity scores. The Calvary had been placed in its display alcove on the morning of the sanctum's founding, and in 41 years of combat class rotations, of senior cadets and decorated veterans and 3 sitting wardens passing through the ceremonial hall, it had remained exactly where it had been placed. Until this morning. Instructor Orithden noticed the absence before he noticed anything else. 41 years of the weapon occupying a specific point in his peripheral vision had apparently installed it in his spatial awareness the way furniture gets installed. Unconsciously, completely, because the moment the alcove was empty, something in the back of his mind registered the wrongness before his eyes confirmed it. He stopped in the doorway of the ceremonial hall. The alcove was empty. Not damaged. Not broken into. The display mount was intact, the atmospheric seal still active, the security logging still running. Something had simply left. He turned to look at the assembled cadets, 63 of them standing in formation for the morning's ceremonial review, and his eyes found the anomaly in approximately 2 seconds. In the third row, a human cadet was holding the Calvary. Not with effort. Not with the two-handed reverence that the weapon's size demanded from even the largest Thorali cadets. She was holding it in her right hand, loosely, with the particular quality of someone holding something that has fit itself to them rather than something they have lifted. She was looking at it, not at him. And her face had the expression of someone hearing a sound no one else in the room can hear. Orithden had been an instructor at the Veteran Combat Sanctum for 19 years. He had seen many things in that time that he had not previously believed were possible. He had not previously believed this was possible. He said nothing. He stood in the doorway for 11 seconds. He counted them, because counting was something his mind did when it needed to slow down, and during those 11 seconds, not a single one of the 63 cadets moved or spoke. The silence in the hall was not the silence of people who have noticed something and are waiting to react. It was the silence of people who have no idea what to do with what they are witnessing and have therefore defaulted to doing nothing at all. Then the cadet looked up. She found him across the hall with an expression that was not guilt and was not triumph. It was more complicated than either. It was the expression of someone who has just been given a responsibility they did not ask for and are not sure they deserve and cannot set down. "Instructor," she said, "I don't know how this happened." Orithden looked at her for a moment. He looked at the Calvary in her hand. He looked at the empty alcove. He made a decision that he would spend the next several weeks questioning, because the alternative was to make a different decision and he could not, standing in that doorway in that silence, identify what the different decision would accomplish. "Formation is dismissed," he said. "Cadet Reyes. My office." Her name was Elena Reyes, and she was in her second year at the Sanctum, which meant she was past the initial assessment phase but not yet cleared for specialized track assignments, which was the phase most cadets considered the critical period, the window during which the Sanctum's instructors decided who you were and what you were going to become. She had entered the Sanctum as part of the Human Integration Cohort, the third such cohort since the Compact had opened its military academies to human enrollment 6 years ago. The first 2 cohorts had produced graduates who were, by the assessment records, competent and unremarkable, which was the most accurate way to describe cadets who met every standard without particularly distinguishing themselves in any direction. Elena Reyes had not been unremarkable. She had also not been distinguished. She had been, by every metric Orithden had applied, precisely average. He had her file open on his desk when she entered his office, and he had been reading it again while he waited, looking for something he had missed the first time, and he had found nothing. Assessment scores in the 50th percentile across the board. No specialized aptitudes flagged. No notable incidents. No recommendations from prior instructors, positive or negative, that carried any particular weight. One notation from her first-year combat theory instructor, a Thorali named Velsara, that read simply, "Cadet demonstrates unusual patience for a second-cycle learner. Monitor for strategic disposition." That was the entirety of what the file said about Elena Reyes that could not have been said about 40 other cadets in the same cohort. She sat down across from him. She had left the Calvary outside his office door, which he had noted with an emotion he chose not to examine closely. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "I came in early," she said. "Before formation. I come in early most mornings to use the hall before it's occupied. The acoustic properties are good for concentration exercises I've been working on." She paused. "The weapon was in its alcove when I arrived. I did my exercises. I was finishing up when I heard something." "What did you hear?" She looked at him steadily. She was not an impressive physical presence. Medium height for a human, which put her in the lower third of the sanctum's height distribution. She had the build of someone who had been training consistently but had not yet developed the specialized musculature of a committed track. Her eyes were doing something interesting. They were doing the thing that Velsara's notation had pointed toward. They were patient. "It's hard to describe accurately," she said. "It was like a frequency. Not a sound exactly. More like the sense of a sound. The way you feel a vibration through a floor before you hear the noise that's causing it." "And you went to the alcove." "I went to look," she said. "I wasn't going to touch it. I know what it is." "Do you?" "The Calvary," she said. "The sanctum's founding weapon. Carried by Warden Auchevel in the Third Containment Campaign. Used in 49 sanctioned engagements without a single recorded loss. Placed in ceremonial display at the sanctum's founding as a symbol of the institution's purpose." She paused. "I've read the historical documentation." Of course she had. He made a note of that and continued. "You went to look and then?" "It was already moving," she said. He stopped. "Moving?" "In the alcove. Just slightly. Like it was pointing toward me." She held his gaze without flinching. "I know how that sounds." "What did you do?" "I held my hand out," she said. "I didn't take it. I let it decide." Orith Den sat with that for a moment. 41 years. Every warden candidate, every decorated senior, every exceptional cadet the sanctum had produced, had walked through that hall. None of them had held out their hand. None of them had apparently been given a reason to. "Why did you hold your hand out?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone constructing an answer. The silence of someone finding the honest one. "Because it was asking," she said. He dismissed her and sat alone in his office for 30 minutes. He called Warden Sephira, who was the sanctum's commanding officer and the individual with the most direct relationship to the Calvary in the institution's current structure. He relayed what had happened. He heard Sephira's breathing change on the other end of the call in the way breathing changes when someone is managing a response that they are not ready to have. "Is it damaged?" Sephira said first. "No. The cadet. Uninjured. Undisturbed." She described it as having asked her permission. A very long pause. "Bring her to me," Sephira said. "And bring the weapon." "It's outside my office," Orith Den said. "On the floor." Another pause. "It let her put it down," Sephira said. "Yes. The documentation states." "I know what the documentation states," Orith Den said. And then, because the documentation stated that the Calvary had only released its bond to a handler at the handler's death, and because Elena Reyes was visibly alive, "I know." Walking through the sanctum's corridors with Elena Reyes and the Calvary was an experience Orith Den would have been happy to skip. The weapon was visible. It was distinctive, recognizable to every cadet and instructor and staff member they passed, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing when they saw who was carrying it. The reactions moved through dismissal and into something more uncomfortable with a speed that told him the word had already traveled. By the time they reached Warden Sephira's administrative level, they had passed 41 people, and not one of them had spoken. Sephira's office was large in the way of spaces that are designed to communicate authority rather than accommodate it. She was standing when they entered, which meant she had been standing since the call, which told Orith Den that she was more unsettled than her voice had indicated. She was thoroughly, like Orith Den, tall and composed with the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades earning the right to occupy space confidently. She looked at the Calvary in Elena's hand and she was quiet for a long time. "Put it on the table," she said. Elena set it on the conference table. Sephira walked around the table and looked at the weapon without touching it, the way a person examines something they are not certain is safe to approach. The Calvary was approximately 1.5 meters in length, slightly longer than Elena was tall, and it had the design aesthetic of Commonwealth-era foundational artifacts, not ornate, not decorated, built with the specific intentionality of something made to function rather than to impress. It was inert on the table. Not glowing, not vibrating, not doing any of the things that the sanctum's foundational mythology attributed to it. Just a weapon, resting. What does it feel like? Sephira said. To Elena. Elena looked at the warden. When I'm holding it or now? When you hold it. Elena considered this with the careful attention that Orithden was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Like it knows where I'm looking, she said. Like it's already compensating for where I'll move next. Like, she paused, finding the words, like it learned me faster than I learned it. Sephira looked at Orithden. The look contained several things. He answered the most urgent of them. Her file is average, he said. Across every metric. That, Sephira said, turning back to Elena, is what I need to understand. The Calvary has a recorded history of resonance with exceptionally capable handlers. The documentation describes the resonance as responsive to demonstrated mastery. Every warden who has carried it arrived with distinguished records, specific aptitude indicators, years of tracked development. She paused. You are in your second year. Your scores are median. I know, Elena said. The weapon should not have responded to you. I know that too, Elena said. She said it without apology and without defiance. She said it with the same quality she'd had since the ceremonial hall, the quality of someone who has not yet finished understanding something and is not going to pretend otherwise. Is there anything, Sephira said, very carefully, that you haven't told us? Any training outside the sanctum's curriculum, any capability you haven't disclosed in your assessments? No, Elena said. And then, after a moment, except the concentration exercises. But those aren't combat training. There's something my grandmother taught me. Both instructors looked at her. My grandmother was a field medic, Elena said. She spent 12 years in conflict zones. She taught me exercises for staying calm under pressure, regulating attention, not letting the environment override your focus. She paused. I've been doing them in the hall every morning because the acoustic properties help with the resonance component. The way sounds move in that space is similar to the way sounds move in the exercises. Sephira stood very still. The Calvary resonates at a specific frequency, she said, documented in the foundational records. The resonance is classified as the weapon sensitivity mechanism. It responds to handlers whose internal state matches the resonance pattern. She stopped. The resonance frequency of the Calvary has never been publicly disclosed. It is not in any document accessible to cadets. Elena looked at her. What is the frequency? She said. Sephira told her. Elena's expression changed. Not dramatically. A small shift, the kind that happens when a person hears a number and recognizes it from somewhere else. That's the target frequency of the concentration exercises, she said. The one my grandmother calibrated for me. She said it was the frequency where attention becomes, her word was, clean. Where you stop filtering what you're perceiving and just perceive it. The silence in Sephira's office was the longest of the morning. Your grandmother, Orithden said quietly. What was her name? Elena told them. Neither of them recognized it. But the way Sephira moved to her terminal and began typing with the specific focused urgency of someone who has just realized they need to find something they should have found earlier told Orithden that the question mattered in a way they hadn't yet fully mapped. He would understand why in approximately 4 hours. The Sanctum's response to the morning's events moved through institutional phases with the specific speed of a large organization processing something it doesn't have a procedure for. By midday, Orithden knew that at least 3 senior instructors had filed formal observation reports. He knew that the combat track's senior assessor, a Serenthi named Tovmer who had been with the Sanctum for 11 years and was not known for being easily impressed, had requested a meeting with Sephira that afternoon. He knew that word had reached the cadet population in the way word always reaches cadet populations, faster than official channels and less accurately, which meant that what most of Elena's cohort had heard by lunch was some version of the story that was technically true and contextually misleading. He found Elena in the practice hall at 1300, alone, running form drills with the Calvary. He stopped in the doorway and watched. She was not performing the drills from the Sanctum's curriculum. She was doing something different, something that used the weapon's specific weight distribution in a way that the curriculum didn't teach, because the curriculum had been built around the weapon's historical handlers and their physical characteristics, none of whom had been human. The form she was working through was adapted. Not arbitrarily, he could see the internal logic of it, the way she had modified the standard positions to match her height and reach, and the particular way humans distribute weight in dynamic movement. She had been doing this for hours. He knew this because he knew the look of someone who has been working on a problem for hours versus the look of someone who has just started, and she had the former. "You adapted the training form," he said. She stopped and turned. She was not out of breath. "The standard form was built for thoroughly biomechanics," she said. "Using it directly would be like wearing armor fitted for someone else. Functional in places, wrong in others. I needed to find where the principles transferred and where they needed to be rebuilt." "In 3 hours," he said. "I started last night," she said. "After I heard the frequency in the hall this morning, I went back through everything I knew about the weapon's historical documentation and started thinking about what a form built for human mechanics would look like." She paused. "I didn't know I'd be holding it today. I was just thinking through a problem." He looked at her for a long moment. "The warden has found something in the archive," he said. "She wants you back in her office." The archive record that Sephara had found was 42 years old. It was a pre-sanctum document, from the period of the institution's founding, filed under the heading Resonance Calibration Research, and cross-referenced with a project designation that had been formally closed 20 years ago due to inconclusive results. The document was 60 pages. Sephara had read the relevant section and highlighted it, and she turned the screen to face Elena when they arrived. The highlighted section described a research initiative that had been conducted in the 2 years before the Sanctum's founding, an attempt to understand the mechanism by which the Calvary selected its handlers. The researchers had documented the resonance frequency, had mapped the weapon's historical handler profiles, and had attempted to identify the common factor. They had found a correlation in handler mental state profiles, specifically in the attentional architecture of individuals who spent extended periods in high-stakes environments requiring sustained focus under threat. The correlation was strong. The mechanism, they concluded, was not about combat skill. It was about a specific quality of attention, a state they described as threat-integrated clarity, where the presence of danger had been so thoroughly incorporated into the handler's baseline that it no longer created noise in their perception. It simply became part of how they saw. The researchers had noted, in a section labeled Peripheral Findings, that this attentional state was extremely rare in population-level surveys. They had identified it in less than 1% of tested subjects across 6 species. They had noted, without particular emphasis, that the testing methodology had not included humans, as humans had not yet been admitted to the Compact's military programs at the time of the research. Below the highlighted section, Sephara had added a handwritten note. It said, "The concentration exercises described by Cadet Reyes produce the exact attentional architecture the research identified. The resonance frequency her grandmother calibrated is the weapon's resonance frequency. Her grandmother knew, " Elena read the note. She read it twice. "My grandmother died 4 years ago," she said. Her voice was even. "She never told me she'd done research for the Sanctum." "She didn't do research for the Sanctum," Sephara said. "She was a field medic. She was never affiliated with this institution." She paused. What she apparently did was arrive, through her own work in conflict environments, at the same understanding the research team arrived at through systematic study. And then she taught it to her granddaughter. Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality than it had had all morning. Smaller, more personal, the quality of something pressing from the inside. She used to say the exercises were so I could be present in difficult situations, she said. So I could be useful when things were going wrong. She said a medic who can't think clearly is just another casualty. She stopped. She was teaching me to be a medic. She was teaching you something older than that, Sephara said. She was teaching you what she'd learned from 12 years of being in places where the cost of losing your focus was someone else's life. She may not have known she was calibrating you to a weapon's resonance frequency, but she knew what she was building. The room held the weight of that for a moment. What happens now? Elena said. Sephara looked at Orithden. He looked back at her. The look exchanged between them was the particular look of two experienced people who have arrived at a situation where the institutional framework genuinely does not have a ready answer and are deciding in real time what the answer should be. Now, Sephara said, we have a problem. The problem arrived from 3 directions within 24 hours, because problems of this kind never arrive from one direction and never wait for you to be ready. The first direction was the Sanctum's senior staff. Tovmer's meeting with Sephara had produced a formal objection, filed through the institutional review process, arguing that the Kelvari's transfer of resonance to a second-year cadet with a median performance record represented a procedural anomaly requiring suspension of all field access for the weapon pending formal review. The argument was technically sound. Tovmer had been doing this long enough to know how to make a technically sound argument, and the argument's technical soundness was not the problem. The problem was what sat underneath it, visible to anyone who looked, which was the discomfort of a senior instructor who had spent 11 years watching exceptional cadets carry their records through this institution and had woken up this morning to find that the institution's most significant symbol had chosen someone with an average file. The Kelvari hadn't confirmed what the Sanctum had been teaching about what mattered. It had questioned it. The second direction was the cadet population. Elena's cohort had processed the morning's events in the way that people process things they witness and cannot explain, by constructing frameworks that make it manageable. The frameworks her cohort had constructed ranged from the charitable to the hostile, and Orithden tracked the range by watching how people moved around Elena in the common areas that afternoon. Some cadets moved toward her, curious and open. Others moved away, not visibly, not rudely, but with the particular unconscious spatial adjustment of people who are uncomfortable and don't want to examine why. A third group watched from middle distances with an expression that took Orithden a moment to identify. It was the expression of people who have reconsidered something they thought was fixed. The third direction was external, and it was the one that changed everything. At 0800 the following morning, Sephara called Orithden before he had reached his office. She said, without preamble, someone filed a compact cultural authority inquiry overnight. Regarding the Kelvari. Who? The filing is under the Thorali Heritage Preservation Council, she said. They're claiming the weapon is a protected cultural artifact under the heritage provision and that its transfer of resonance to a non-Thorali individual constitutes a cultural violation requiring recovery of the artifact. Orithden stopped walking. The Kelvari chose her, he said. The Heritage Council's position is that the weapon cannot meaningfully choose, Sephara said. Their legal filing argues that the resonance mechanism is a physical property, not a volitional act, and that allowing a non-Thorali cadet to operate with a Thorali heritage weapon normalizes the appropriation of cultural military tradition. That's a political argument dressed in legal language. Yes, Sephara said. It is. And it will take 6 months to formally adjudicate, during which time the Council is requesting voluntary suspension of the cadet's access to the weapon. The pause. They're also requesting her records. The full assessment file. Orithden understood immediately what the records would show. Median scores. Nothing exceptional. A file that could, by someone arguing in a particular direction, be used to support the claim that the resonance was a mechanical anomaly rather than a meaningful selection, because what could an average cadet have that a decorated senior candidate lacked? The answer was grandmother's hands in the dark, calibrating a frequency she'd found in 12 years of staying present while people died. But that answer wasn't in the file. He went to find Elena. She was in the practice hall again. She had been there since early morning. She had the specific quality of someone who has heard news they needed time alone with and has chosen to spend that time doing the thing that gives them clarity. You know about the Heritage Council filing, he said. Tovmer told me this morning, she said. She kept moving through the form. He didn't have to. He could have waited for the official notification. I think he told me himself because he wanted to see how I'd react. How did you react? I thanked him for telling me. She completed the sequence and brought the weapon to rest. Was that the wrong reaction? What did Tovmer say? He asked me why I thanked him. She turned to face him. I told him that he was the most senior assessor I'd encounter at this stage of my training, and that his opinion of my character would outlast the situation, and that I'd rather he thought well of me regardless of how the legal question resolved. She paused. He was quiet for a moment and then he left. Orith Den looked at her. The filing is going to be used against you, he said. The council will argue that your record doesn't justify the weapons selection. I know. They may succeed, depending on how the compact authority adjudicates the heritage provision question. I know that too. She met his eyes. What would you do? In my position? He thought about this carefully, because she was asking it seriously and she deserved a serious answer. I would think about what I was actually being asked to demonstrate, he said. Not to the council. Not to the compact authority. To the institution itself. He paused. The Sanctum's purpose is to produce people who can be trusted with the hardest things. The Heritage Council's argument is that you haven't demonstrated that trust is warranted. The formal record agrees with them. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether you can change what the record says before 6 months of legal process changes what's possible. She nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly. Acknowledgement. The look of someone who has just had a thing they already knew confirmed by someone whose confirmation matters. I need 6 weeks, she said. The compact authority's preliminary hearing is in 8. Then I have 8, she said. But I only need 6. He didn't ask what she meant. He had learned, in the last 36 hours, that Elena Reyes explained things when she had finished understanding them and not before, and that this was not evasion. It was the same precision she applied to everything. She wasn't going to tell him what she was building until she knew it would stand. What she built over the next 6 weeks was not what he expected. He had anticipated a performance. A sustained display of exceptional combat performance designed to address the gap between her record and the weapons selection. He had seen this before from cadets under pressure. The pivot to visible excellence, the deliberate stacking of impressive outcomes, the campaign of conspicuous capability. It was a rational response to the situation she was in. It would have worked, probably. Not perfectly, but enough. She didn't do it. Instead, she did the opposite of a performance. She opened her practice sessions. She had been training alone in the hall every morning, and she continued training in the hall every morning, but she stopped closing the door. Cadets who came early found her already there, and she didn't stop when they arrived. She kept working. And because she kept working, they stayed and watched, and because they watched, they began to see something the file didn't contain. It started as curiosity. Cadets watching another cadet train. The idle attention of people with time before formation. But curiosity, when it encounters something worth being curious about, doesn't stay idle. By the end of the 2nd week, there were cadets who were arriving early specifically because she was there. By the end of the 3rd week, she was being asked questions. Combat theory questions, form questions, situational questions, the kind of questions cadets ask instructors when they trust the answer more than they trust themselves to find it. She answered them the way she answered everything, carefully, completely, without oversimplifying. Orith Den watched this from a distance. He also watched Tovmer watching it, which was its own kind of data. At the end of week 4, Tovmer appeared in Orith Den's office unannounced and sat down across the desk with the expression of a man who has been revising his position for 4 weeks and has arrived at the revision. She hasn't changed her scores, he said. The formal metrics are the same. No, Orith Den agreed. But something is different. He was quiet for a moment. She's been teaching the morning sessions informally for 3 weeks. I've been monitoring from the observation gallery. The cadets who've been attending show measurable improvement in their attentional performance. He paused on the word attentional as though it had just arrived in his vocabulary. The concentration exercises. She's been teaching them. Yes. The frequency calibration component, Tovmer said. The specific attentional architecture that the weapon's resonance responds to. He stopped. She's been teaching the other cadets how to do what she does. Orith Den looked at him. She's not building a record, Tovmer said. She's building a cohort. He said it slowly, the way someone says something when the full implication is still arriving. If it works, if the attentional training transfers, the sanctum will have multiple cadets capable of resonance-compatible states. The Heritage Council's argument that this is an anomaly will be undermined. Because if you can teach it, it isn't an anomaly. It's a methodology. Yes, Orith Den said. Tovmer sat with this. She's not defending herself, he said. She's making the defense unnecessary by changing what the sanctum produces. She's doing what her grandmother did, Orith Den said. She's teaching what she knows because she believes it matters. The legal situation is real. But it's not the most important thing in the room. Tovmer was quiet for a long time. I filed an objection, he said. Formally. I know. I'm going to file an amendment. He stood. He said it without drama, with the specific manner of a man who has made a decision and intends to execute it cleanly. The Compact Authority hearing is in 2 weeks. I'm submitting an assessor's supplemental record documenting what I've observed in the practice hall. The attentional performance improvements in the attending cadets are measurable. I can quantify them. He paused at the door. She should know I'm doing this. Tell her yourself, Orith Den said. The Compact Authority's preliminary hearing took place via remote session, which meant that Elena sat in a small room in the sanctum's administrative block and responded to questions from a panel she could see on a screen but not reach. The Heritage Council's legal representative was thorough and well-prepared, and the argument they made was the argument Orith Den had expected. The resonance was a mechanical property. The selection was anomalous. The cadet's formal record did not support the interpretation that the selection was meaningful rather than accidental. Then Tovmer's supplemental record was presented. The attentional performance improvements he had documented were not dramatic numbers. They were the kind of numbers that required context to understand. 3 and 4 and 7% improvements in specific cognitive metrics across 14 cadets over 6 weeks of informal training. Not the kind of numbers that win arguments at first glance. The kind of numbers that win arguments when the person reading them understands what the metrics measure, and what it means that 14 cadets improve them by attending voluntary morning sessions run by a second year with a median file. The Heritage Council's representative requested a recess. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When the panel reconvened, the senior adjudicator asked Elena directly, "What are you teaching them?" "How to be present," Elena said. "How to stop fighting the difficulty of a situation and start working within it. How to let what's real be real without it overwhelming what you need to do." She paused. "My grandmother taught me. She learned it because her job required her to be useful when everything was going wrong. And you believe this is what the weapon responds to," the adjudicator said. "The weapon responded before I had any theory about why," Elena said. "I've been working backward from what happened, trying to understand it accurately. The most honest answer I have is this. The weapon found someone who had been taught, by someone who loved her, to stay present in hard things. And I've been trying to share that, because it seems like the kind of thing that shouldn't belong only to one person." The Heritage Council's challenge was suspended pending further review, which was not a victory and was not a defeat and was, as these things sometimes are, exactly the right outcome for a situation that needed more time to become what it was going to become. Elena walked out of the administrative block into the sanctum's main corridor, and Orith Den was waiting. He fell into step beside her without speaking, because there wasn't an obvious thing to say, and they walked the length of the corridor in silence. She stopped at the practice hall door. "She would have hated this," Elena said. "My grandmother. She never wanted attention for the things she knew. She taught me because I was hers to teach, not because she thought it made her important." "What did she think it made her?" Orith Den said. Elena looked through the practice hall window. 3 cadets inside, working through the morning's exercises, the specific focused stillness of people learning to be present. She watched them for a moment. "Useful," she said. She opened the door and went in. Orith Den stood in the corridor and watched through the window as she joined the 3 cadets, setting the Kelvari against the wall with the ease of someone setting down something familiar, and began to teach. Patient. Precise. Unhurried. The quality of someone who knows the thing they know is worth knowing and trusts that the knowing of it is enough. He thought about 41 years of an empty alcove's presence in his peripheral vision. He thought about the specific geometry of a thing that has been waiting for the right person and the quality of patience that requires. He thought about a field medic who had found, in 12 years of staying useful while everything went wrong, a frequency that a weapon recognized centuries after it had been named. He thought that the Heritage Council had argued the weapon couldn't choose. He thought they were going to have a very long time to reconsider that position. Through the window, the cadets were learning to be still inside difficulty. Learning the difference between the silence of giving up and the silence of becoming completely, dangerously present. Learning what it felt like when the noise of a hard situation stopped being a problem and started being information. The Kelvari rested against the wall. It did not glow. It did not vibrate. It simply waited, the way it had always waited, for the moment it would be needed again. And in the watching of it, in the particular quality of its stillness, Orith Den understood something he had not understood that morning in the ceremonial hall, had not understood in all the conversations since, had only now, standing in a corridor watching a cadet teach other cadets how to survive the presence of hard things, arrived at fully. The weapon had not chosen a prodigy. It had not chosen a champion. It had chosen someone who had been taught that being useful was enough. Who had walked into a room with something ancient and enormous and had simply held out her hand, because it was asking, and she had been taught her whole life to respond when something needed her. The galaxy would spend years arguing about what that meant. Elena Reyes would spend that time in the practice hall, teaching anyone who came through the door, patient and precise and entirely unimpressed by the size of what she'd started. Which was, Orith Den suspected,